Imagine a tomb. Not just any tomb, but a walking sarcophagus of ceramite and adamantium, standing silent in the darkness of a forgotten battlefield. Inside, suspended in amniotic fluids, lies what remains of a space marine hero. His body is broken beyond all recognition, reduced to little more than a torso, a head, and fragments of vital organs kept alive by ancient technology. His mind drifts through dreamless centuries, experiencing a kind of death that refuses to become final. This is a dreadnought, and it has been sleeping for 1,575 years. Now imagine a different kind of nightmare descending upon this silent guardian. Picture a horde of green-skinned Xenos, their crude technology sputtering and roaring, their minds focused on only three things: fighting, looting, and finding the biggest, loudest scrap they can get their meaty hands on. The Orks have arrived, and they've just found something that ticks every box of what makes an Ork's heart race. With excitement. It's big, it's made of metal, it's covered in weapons, and best of all, it looks like it might be worth a proper fight. What happens next is a collision between two of the galaxy's most terrifying forces. On one side, you have the Orks, a species genetically engineered for warfare, whose very existence violates the known laws of physics through sheer collective belief. On the other, you have one of the Imperium's most revered war machines, a walking tank piloted by a consciousness that has survived for over a millennium and a half, waiting for the moment when it will be called to war once more. The stage is set for something that embodies everything that makes Warhammer 40,000 both horrifying and darkly fascinating. The year is irrelevant in the grim darkness of the far future. Time has become a meaningless concept on this world, a planet whose name has been lost to imperial records, buried under layers of bureaucratic forgetting that characterize the vast and creaking machinery of the Imperium of man. Perhaps it was once called Tertius Prime, or Salvation's End, or Throne's Reach. The name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that 15 centuries ago, this world saw battle. Space Marines of an unknown chapter fought here against an enemy long since turned to dust. The fight was brutal, as all fights in this universe tend to be, and when it was over, the victorious Astartes withdrew, leaving behind their dead and a single dreadnought, its systems critically damaged, its pilot locked in emergency stasis. The chapter meant to return. They always mean to return. But the galaxy is vast, and the Imperium is beset on all sides by enemies that outnumber the stars themselves. Wars upon wars stacked themselves like bodies in a mass grave. The chapter that fought here may have been destroyed in some subsequent campaign. Their records may have been lost in a catastrophic data corruption. Their fortress monastery may have been swallowed by a warp storm. The reasons are endless and ultimately irrelevant. The result is the same. The dreadnought was forgotten, left standing in the ruins of a battlefield that nature slowly began to reclaim. For 1,575 years, it stood there. Vines grew across its ceramite plating. Rust, that patient destroyer, began its slow work on joints and seams. Small animals made nests in the gaps between armor plates. Rain fell and seasons changed, and the world turned beneath alien stars, and still the dreadnought stood, a silent sentinel over a battlefield where nothing remained to guard. Inside, the pilot slept a sleep deeper than death, his consciousness reduced to the barest spark of existence, his dreams, if he had any, lost in the vast and terrible darkness of enforced hibernation. And then the Orks arrived. The Ork philosophy of looting. Before we dive deeper into the specifics of this encounter, we need to understand the Ork perspective on looting and salvage. This is not simply opportunistic scavenging. For Orks, looting is an art form, a cultural practice, and in some cases, a religious experience. The Ork relationship with looted technology stems from their genetically encoded understanding of engineering. Every Ork possesses some innate knowledge of how things work, but this knowledge is strange and contradictory by imperial standards. An Ork looks at a broken imperial vehicle, and sees not a piece of junk, but raw materials waiting to be reborn as something better, something more orky. Looters, those orcs who specialize in salvage, occupy a unique position in greenskin society. They are not quite mech boys, lacking the deep technical knowledge to build things from scratch, but they have an eye for valuable technology that exceeds even that of most mechs. A good looter can walk through a battlefield and immediately identify which pieces of equipment are worth taking and which should be left to rust. The best looters develop reputations that spread across entire sectors. Stories circulate among orc warbands about legendary looters who have claimed incredible prizes. There is the tale of Grab a Gutsbag, an orc who supposedly looted an entire Imperial Titan by somehow convincing its machine spirit that he was its rightful pilot. Whether this story is true or merely an orc legend is irrelevant. What matters is that orcs believe it could be true, and in the strange reality-warping field of the War, belief has power. When looters find something truly impressive, something that represents not just good salvage but a genuine trophy, they will go to extraordinary lengths to claim it. They will fight their own warband for possession rights. They will spend months planning elaborate raids just to acquire a single piece of equipment. And once they have claimed their prize, they will defend it with a ferocity that would make a space marine proud. Dreadnoughts represent the ultimate looting prize for several reasons. First, they are big. Orcs respect size above almost all else, and a dreadnought is significantly larger than even the biggest orc. Second, they are covered in weapons, and orcs can never have enough dakka. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they represent a challenge. A dormant dreadnought is a mystery wrapped in an enigma, wrapped in ceramite armor. What makes it work? How can it be made to work again? And most excitingly, what happens if we manage to wake it up? The orc desire to tinker with captured technology is not purely practical. There is an element of what humans would call scientific curiosity, though orcs would never describe it that way. Mech boys in particular experience genuine joy from figuring out how enemy technology works and how it can be improved, which in orc terms usually means making it bigger, louder, or more likely to explode. This cultural context is essential to understanding what happened when Scarfang's warband found brother Captain Meridius. They were not simply looking at a piece of military hardware. They were looking at the opportunity for status, for technological advancement, and for what promised to be an absolutely spectacular fight. From an orc perspective, finding a dormant dreadnought is like a human archaeologist finding the lost tomb of a pharaoh, if that tomb also happened to contain a working tank, and the mummified pharaoh was willing to fight you for it. The nature of the dreadnought. To understand what the orcs have found, we must first understand what a dreadnought truly is. In the propaganda of the Imperium, dreadnoughts are portrayed as honored veterans, mighty warriors, given the privilege of serving the Emperor beyond the normal span of even a space marine's extended life. The reality is far more complex and infinitely more tragic. A space marine who becomes a dreadnought has not been honored. He has been denied death. When a battle brother suffers wounds so catastrophic that even the legendary regenerative abilities of the Astartes cannot save him, when his body is reduced to ruins by enemy fire or torn apart by alien claws, when there is nothing left but a torso, a head, and the barest functioning of vital organs, then and only then does he become a candidate for internment within a dreadnought chassis. The process is not gentle. The remains of the warrior are suspended in amniotic fluids within an armored sarcophagus. Neural interfaces are driven directly into his brain and spine, creating a permanent connection between flesh and machine. The pain of this interface is said to be excruciating, a constant burning sensation that never fully fades. But the physical pain is nothing compared to the psychological torment. You see, the human brain, even one enhanced by the genetic modifications that create a space marine, was never meant to interface with a machine as large and complex as a dreadnought. The mental stress of controlling a multi-ton war machine through direct neural connection is immense. Over time, this stress manifests in various forms of mental degradation. Dreadnought pilots experience lethargy, confusion, dyschronometria, a condition where one's sense of time becomes completely distorted, and eventually, senility. They forget their names, they forget their brothers, they forget everything except the roar of guns and the crunch of enemy bodies beneath their metal feet. This is why dreadnoughts sleep. Between battles, the chapter's tech marines seal them in stasis vaults, deep within the armory of the fortress monastery. In these sacred shrines, the fallen heroes rest in dreamless darkness, their consciousness reduced to almost nothing, their existence a kind of living death that can last for centuries. Some dreadnoughts are only awakened once every 1,000 years. Others remain sealed for even longer periods, their services called upon only in the most dire of circumstances. The dreadnought standing on this forgotten battlefield has been in stasis for 1,575 years. That's not an estimate. That's the exact count maintained by the chronometer built into its systems, still faithfully ticking away the centuries despite the damage to its external structure. Inside the sarcophagus, the pilot exists in a state that is neither life nor death. His body, what little remains of it, is perfectly preserved in the amniotic suspension. His brain continues to function at the absolute minimum level necessary to maintain the spark of consciousness. He is not dreaming. He is not thinking. He simply is, suspended in a moment that has lasted for longer than most civilizations endure. His name, if you could access the damaged databanks in the Dreadnought's cogitator systems, was Brother Captain Meridius of the Storm Wardens. Chapter. He fell in battle against a Chaos incursion, his body crushed beneath the treads of a Chaos land raider after he had personally destroyed 3 enemy rhinos and held a critical bridge position for 6 hours against overwhelming odds. His chapter, impressed by his valor and unwilling to lose such a skilled commander, had him interred in this dreadnought chassis. That was in the year that Imperial records would designate as 423 M39, though such dating means little in a galaxy where time itself can become fluid in the presence of warp storms. Brother Captain Meridius has been asleep since the battle that damaged his chassis. He has no awareness of the passage of time. He does not know that his chapter, the Storm Wardens, still exists and still fights in the Emperor's name, though they long ago abandoned this sector of space. He does not know that the battle he fought here has been completely forgotten, erased from Imperial records by the simple passage of centuries and the Imperium's bureaucratic incompetence. He knows nothing. He is nothing but a spark of consciousness, waiting for the signal that will drag him back to wakefulness and war. The Dreadnought itself is a Castroferrum Pattern Mark V, one of the most common Dreadnought chassis deployed by Space Marine chapters in the 41st Millennium. It stands approximately 4 meters tall, a towering edifice of ceramite armor plates and adamantium skeletal structure. Its left arm is equipped with a power fist, a massive hydraulic claw capable of crushing tank armor or tearing apart enemy vehicles. Its right arm once mounted an assault cannon, though the weapon has long since jammed, its mechanisms frozen by time and lack of maintenance. The armor plating bears the storm cloud blue and white colors of the Storm Wardens, though 1,500 years of exposure to the elements has faded the paint to pale ghosts of their original hues. The chapter symbol, a stylized lightning bolt striking through a shield, is still barely visible on the Dreadnought's glacis plate, though vines have grown across it in intricate patterns. Purity seals, those strips of parchment inscribed with holy words and affixed to armor with wax stamps, hang in tatters from various points on the chassis, their words long since weathered into illegibility. The damage the Dreadnought sustained in its final battle is extensive but not catastrophic. The assault cannon's ammunition feed has been severed, rendering the weapon useless. The right leg's hydraulic system has lost pressure, though the mechanical seal has prevented complete failure. Most critically, the power core that provides energy to the chassis has been damaged, causing it to automatically enter a low-power emergency mode that preserves the pilot's life support at the cost of all other functions. This is why the Dreadnought has remained locked in stasis for so long. It lacks the power to wake itself, and without external activation by tech marines, it cannot return to function. But the Dreadnought's machine spirit, that quasi-mystical consciousness that the Adeptus Mechanicus believes inhabits all sufficiently complex machines, has not died. Deep in the cogitator cores, ancient, programming routines continue to run their endless loops, monitoring the pilot's vital signs, maintaining the integrity of the sarcophagus seals, counting the seconds and minutes and years as they accumulate into centuries. The machine waits, patient as only a machine can be, for the moment when it will be called to war once more. That moment is about to arrive, though not in any way that the original tech marines who sealed this Dreadnought could have anticipated. The Ork menace. The Orks are one of the most successful species in the entire galaxy. This is a fact that the Imperium of man desperately tries to suppress, but it remains true nonetheless. Orks outnumber humans. They outnumber the Tau. They probably outnumber every other intelligent species, except possibly the Tyranids. And the Tyranids don't count, because they're not really a species, so much as a single vast organism that happens to be divided into trillions of separate bodies. The reason for Ork success is simple. They reproduce through spores. Every Ork constantly sheds these spores from its skin, and when an Ork dies, it releases millions more. These spores burrow into the ground and grow into a kind of plant-like womb that nourishes the development of the Orkoid ecosystem. First come the squigs, simple fungal creatures that serve as food and sometimes as weapons. Then come the snotlings, tiny creatures with rudimentary intelligence that tend the fungus farms. Then the Gretchen, larger and smarter servants who perform menial labor. Finally, the Orks themselves emerge, fully grown and ready for war. This means that anywhere Orks go, they leave behind the seeds of future Ork infestations. A single Ork landing on a planet can, given enough time, spawn an entire warg that consumes the world. It is almost impossible to completely cleanse a planet of Ork infestation. Even the most thorough exterminatus, the complete destruction of a world's biosphere, cannot guarantee that every Ork spore has been eliminated. But the Orks' reproductive strategy is only part of what makes them dangerous. The real threat comes from their psychology and their bizarre relationship with reality itself. Orks are, quite simply, designed for war. Everything about them, from their thick skulls to their redundant organ systems to their ability to grow larger and stronger the more they fight, is optimized for combat. An Ork is as tough as a space marine, despite being created through far cruder biological processes. They can survive injuries that would kill a normal human several times over. They feel no fear in the way other species understand it. To an Ork, battle is not a terrifying necessity, but the highest form of joy. This love of violence is baked into Ork psychology at the genetic level. Orks do not fight because they must. They fight because they want to, because fighting is, to them, the entire purpose of existence. They have no concept of love, no real understanding of familial bonds, no artistic drive beyond the creation of bigger and louder weapons. What they have instead is an all-consuming need for the next battle, the next opponent, the next opportunity to prove themselves through violence. The Ork hierarchy is based entirely on size and strength. The bigger an Ork is, the more respect it commands from other Orks. And Orks grow throughout their entire lives, with growth being directly tied to success in combat. An Ork who survives many battles and wins many fights will begin to grow larger and more muscular. As it grows, it becomes more aggressive and assertive. If it wins enough fights, it may become a nob, a leader of Orks who is noticeably larger and tougher than the average greenskin. War bosses, the rulers of Ork tribes and the leaders of wargs, are enormous specimens, sometimes standing 3 meters tall or more, their muscles bulging with barely contained violence. And if a war boss continues to grow and continues to win, if it attracts more and more Orks to its banner, it may eventually become a warlord, commanding millions or even billions of greenskins in campaigns that can devastate entire sectors. This system is maintained by the warg itself, a gestalt psychic field that all Orks generate and contribute to. The warg field allows Orks to instinctively recognize who is bigger and stronger, and therefore who is in charge. It grows stronger as Orks enjoy themselves, which usually means fighting, and in turn, this strengthening of the warg field makes the Orks even more confident and aggressive, creating a feedback loop that can turn a small raiding party into a planet-crushing horde in a matter of years. But the warg field does something else, something that makes Orks unique among the species of the galaxy. It makes their technology work. Ork technology, by all rights, should not function. A typical Ork shooter is literally slapped together from scrap metal, bits of wire, and whatever else the mech boy could find lying around. By any reasonable standard of engineering, it should explode in the user's hands or simply fail to fire at all. But when an Ork pulls the trigger, the gun fires. Ork vehicles, ramshackle constructions of welded plates and exposed engines that seem to violate every principle of aerodynamics and mechanical stability, somehow manage to race across battlefields and even fly through the air. Ork ships, vast collections of scrap metal, held together by the most optimistic possible interpretation of structural integrity, successfully traverse the void between stars. This works because of the War field. The collective psychic presence of Orks creates a field that, within limits, makes things work the way Orks believe they should work. If enough Orks believe that their shooters will fire, they will fire. If enough Orks believe that red vehicles go faster, then red vehicles do go faster when driven by Orks. If enough Orks believe that their ramshackle spacecraft can travel through the warp, then it can, despite lacking any of the sophisticated systems that other species require for safe warp transit. This does not mean that Orks can make anything happen just by believing in it. The War field has limits. An Ork cannot simply believe that a stick is a gun and have it fire bullets. But if a mech boy builds something that conceptually resembles a gun, even if the engineering is completely nonsensical, the War field will provide that extra push needed to make it actually function. Mech boys themselves are another crucial aspect of Ork society. These are Orks with an innate genetic understanding of engineering and technology. They do not learn their craft through study or apprenticeship. Instead, the knowledge is hard-coded into their genetic structure, released gradually as they grow. A mech boy simply knows how to build things, though what they build is crude, dangerous, and built according to principles that would make any tech priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus weep with frustration. Mech boys are essential to any Ork warband. Without them, vehicles would fall apart, weapons would jam, and the Orks would be reduced to fighting with their bare hands and whatever rocks they could find. Not that this would stop them from fighting, but it would significantly reduce their effectiveness. As such, mech boys occupy a privileged position in Ork society, able to command respect and resources through their ability to keep the war machine running. Big mechs, the strongest and most talented mech boys, are even more important. These individuals can build truly impressive pieces of technology, from the massive gargants that tower over battlefields like mobile fortresses, to the devastating shock attack guns that literally teleport snotlings into the bodies of enemy soldiers. Big mechs sometimes accumulate enough power and respect to lead their own wars, commanding other Orks through a combination of technological superiority and sheer size. One subset of orcs deserves special mention in this context: the looters. These orcs specialize in scavenging equipment from battlefields and enemy camps. While all orcs have some tendency toward looting, looters have raised it to an art form. They are equipped with the heaviest weapons they can find, often taken from defeated enemies and modified to suit orc sensibilities. A looter might carry a heavy bolter torn from a destroyed space marine vehicle, or a Tau rail rifle modified with extra triggers and more dakka, or even weapons whose original purpose has been completely obscured by layers of orc modifications. Looters work closely with mech boys, providing them with raw materials and interesting technology to study and replicate. And when orcs encounter something truly impressive, something big and dangerous and covered in weapons, looters and mech boys will go to extraordinary lengths to claim it for the war. Which brings us back to the dormant Dreadnought. The discovery. The orcs did not come to this world looking for the Dreadnought. They came because they were bored. This particular band of greenskins belonged to the evil Suns clan, orcs obsessed with speed and vehicles. They had been part of a larger war, led by war boss Gutsmasha, a massive orc whose ambition was to conquer an entire subsector. But the war had stalled after running into a particularly stubborn Imperial Guard regiment backed by a detachment of Titans. The resulting battle had been glorious by orc standards, but ultimately unsuccessful. Gutsmasher himself had been killed when a warlord-class Titan stepped on him, and the war had fractured into dozens of smaller warbands, all looking for their next fight. This particular warband was led by a knob named Scarfang, who had earned his name by ripping the jaw off a Chaos Space Marine during the battle and wearing it as a trophy. Scarfang had maybe 300 boys under his command, along with a couple dozen Gretchen, a handful of knobs who served as his lieutenants, and one big mech named Bludget, who maintained the warband's collection of vehicles. Scarfang's warband had been raiding through this sector for months, hitting isolated Imperial worlds, fighting anyone they could find, and generally enjoying themselves. But the pickings had been getting slim. The Imperium had responded to their raids by evacuating several worlds and establishing a defensive perimeter that even Scarfang had to admit was too well defended to crack with his current forces. So they had landed on this world, a planet that showed up on their looted star charts as Tertius Prime, but which appeared to be completely uninhabited. The orcs didn't care about the lack of inhabitants. They were here to loot, to see if there was anything worth taking, and maybe to find some signs of where the next fight might be. If there was nothing here, they'd move on. The galaxy was big, and there were always more worlds to raid. The warband had established a temporary camp near the ruins of what had once been an Imperial settlement. The orcs spread out in search of anything interesting, their natural tendency toward mayhem kept barely in check by Scarfang's leadership. Gretchen scurried through collapsed buildings looking for salvage. Mechboy Bludget set up a workshop in the shell of a destroyed warehouse and began the never-ending task of maintaining the warband's vehicles. The boys entertained themselves by fighting each other, a normal and expected part of orc culture. It was one of the boys, an orc named Grimgut, who found the Dreadnought. Grimgut had been wandering through the ruins of an old battlefield, looking for interesting bits of scrap, or maybe some unexploded ammunition that he could bring back to camp. The battlefield was old enough that nature had reclaimed most of it. Trees had grown up through the shattered remains of bunkers. Vines covered what had once been trenches. The bones of the dead, both human and alien, had long since been scattered by scavengers or buried under layers of fallen leaves. But even covered in vegetation, the Dreadnought was impossible to miss. Grimgut pushed through a particularly thick patch of undergrowth and suddenly found himself staring at what looked like a massive metal giant. The vines and rust obscured many of its details, but Grimgut's crude but effective orc brain immediately recognized several important facts. First, it was big, really big, bigger than a killer can, maybe even bigger than a Def Dread. Second, it was covered in armor, thick plates of what looked like very good metal, the kind that could be melted down and reused for all sorts of projects. Third, and most importantly, it had weapons. Big weapons. Even covered in rust and vegetation, Grimgut could see the massive fist on one arm and what looked like some kind of big shooter on the other. Grimgut's eyes, beady and red with typical orcish coloration, widened with excitement. This was a proper find. This was the kind of thing that would make the other boys respect him. This was exactly the sort of discovery that could earn him extra teeth, maybe even a promotion to Nob if Scarfang was feeling generous. He pushed closer, his natural orc caution warring with his natural orc curiosity. The thing didn't move, it just stood there, silent and still, like some kind of weird statue. But it wasn't a statue. Grimgut could see the joints in the legs, the way the arms were attached to the shoulders. This was some kind of walker, a war machine like the ones the orcs themselves built, but made with far better craftsmanship. Grimgut reached out and rapped his knuckles against the ceramite plating. The sound was dull, absorbed by the layers of rust and vine growth. He tried again, harder, his orc strength producing a more satisfying clang that echoed through the forest. Still, the machine didn't move. "Oi!" Grimgut shouted at it, because orcs will talk to anything if they think it might respond to sufficient volume. "You dead, or just resting?" The Dreadnought, predictably, did not answer. Grimgut circled around it, examining it from all angles. The thing was stuck in place, its feet having sunk into the soft forest floor over the centuries. Roots had grown around and even through some of the lower leg joints. The whole thing had a definite tilt to it, like it might topple over if pushed hard enough. But what really caught Grimgut's attention was the massive fist. It was easily as big as Grimgut's entire torso, a hydraulic claw that could crush metal and bone with equal ease. "Boss is gonna love this," Grimgut said to himself, his crude, orcish mind already imagining the status he would gain from this discovery. "Gonna have to get Bludget to look at it. Maybe we can get it working again." He turned and ran back toward camp, crashing through the underbrush with typical orc disregard for stealth or subtlety. Behind him, the Dreadnought remained motionless, a silent guardian that did not yet know that its long sleep was about to be rudely interrupted. Initial orc reactions. When Grimgut burst into the camp bellowing about his discovery, the initial reaction from the other orcs was skepticism mixed with interest. Orcs make claims all the time, most of them wildly exaggerated, and the boys had learned to take such proclamations with a grain of salt. But Grimgut's enthusiasm was infectious, and more importantly, several of the knobs were bored enough to want to see what all the fuss was about. Scarfang himself, lounging in what passed for his command tent and gnawing on a squig haunch, decided that investigating was preferable to sitting around camp listening to his boys fight. He hauled his considerable bulk upright, grabbed his favorite chopper, and gestured for his personal retinue of knobs to follow. Within minutes, a mob of about 30 orcs was following Grimgut back through the forest, each one eager to see what had gotten him so excited. The orcs' first sight of the Dreadnought provoked a variety of reactions, all of them loud. "Zoginel!" one knob shouted. "Look at the size of that thing!" "That's a right proper walker, that is," another added. "Who built it, you think?" "Don't matter who built it," a third knob said, already pulling out a large wrench and approaching the Dreadnought with clear intentions. "Matters that we found it." Scarfang pushed through the crowd of his boys, his keen orcish instincts immediately analyzing the find. He'd seen machines like this before, though usually from a distance and usually while they were actively shooting at him. The Humies built these things, he knew, put their biggest and strongest warriors inside them and sent them into battle. This one was clearly damaged and inactive, which meant it was ripe for looting. But Scarfang was clever by orc standards, which meant he had learned that some things were better handled by specialists. He turned to one of his boys and barked out an order. "You, go get Bludget. Tell him we found something interesting." The boy took off running, and Scarfang turned his attention back to the Dreadnought. In the meantime, the other orcs were already swarming over it like green-skinned ants on a particularly interesting piece of sugar. They pulled at the vines, scraped at the rust, and examined every visible joint and seam. Several of the larger knobs were trying to force open what looked like access panels, though centuries of corrosion had sealed them tight. "Careful with that fist," Scarfang warned, as one particularly enthusiastic orc climbed up the Dreadnought's arm to get a better look at the power fist. "Thing might still have some fight in it." The warning came too late. The orc had grabbed onto one of the hydraulic tubes running along the power fist's wrist, and his weight combined with the corrosion caused the tube to rupture. A spray of ancient hydraulic fluid, dark and foul-smelling after 1,500 years of containment, sprayed out across the orc and several of his companions.
"Oi! Watch where you're spraying that!"
One of the drenched orcs shouted, wiping the fluid from his face. He sniffed his hand, made a disgusted face, and then, in a display of orcish practicality, wondered aloud if the fluid might be flammable and therefore useful. By the time Mechboy Bludget arrived, the Dreadnought was surrounded by orcs, all of them offering opinions on what should be done with it. Bludget pushed through the crowd, his mechadendrites, crude orcish versions of the servo arms used by tech priests, waving irritably at any orc who got too close. Bludget was a big mech by orc standards, which meant he was both large and possessed of more technical knowledge than the average greenskin. He wore a patchwork of armor plates scavenged from a dozen different sources, and his head was mostly hidden behind a welding mask covered in crude orcish glyphs. The various tools hanging from his belt clanked together as he walked, creating a symphony of mechanical noise that somehow seemed appropriate. He stopped a few meters from the Dreadnought and studied it with the careful eye of someone who actually understood what he was looking at. Unlike the other orcs, who saw only a big metal thing with weapons, Bludget could recognize the craftsmanship that had gone into its construction. This was Humi work, no doubt about it. Good Humi work too, the kind made by those space marine gits who were always such a pain to fight. "Dreadnought," Bludget pronounced, his voice carrying the authority of technical knowledge. "That's what the Humies call 'em. Big metal coffins with guns and legs." "Can we loot it?" Scarfang asked, getting straight to the point. Bludget approached the Dreadnought, his mechadendrites extending to probe at various points on the chassis. One arm scraped away some of the rust near what looked like a power coupling. Another tapped on the ceramite plating, listening to the sound it made. A third extended a crude scanning device that beeped and clicked as it analyzed the Dreadnought's power signature. "It's got power," Bludget said, after a moment. "Not much, but some. Keeping something alive inside, looks like." This provoked excited murmuring among the orcs. Something alive meant something to fight, which was always good news. "Can we crack it open and see what's inside?" one of the knobs asked eagerly. Bludget considered this. On one hand, cracking open the sarcophagus would definitely reveal what was inside, and might provide interesting biological specimens to study. On the other hand, if the thing inside was still alive, it might object to being exposed to the air, and besides, the Dreadnought was far more valuable as a complete unit. "Nah," Bludget said. "Better to keep it whole. We can get this thing working again, I think. Take it back to camp, give it a proper look over, maybe even get it walking." The idea of getting the Dreadnought operational sparked immediate enthusiasm among the orcs. A walking war machine covered in guns was exactly the sort of thing that would make other orcs respect Scarfang's warband. It might even attract more boys to join them, sensing the promise of good fights ahead. "Right!" Scarfang bellowed. "You lot, get some chains and cables. We're dragging this thing back to camp." What followed was a typically orcish display of brute force problem-solving. Orcs scattered in all directions, returning with chains looted from their vehicles, cables cut from destroyed machinery, and even some heavy ropes that had been part of the camp's supply stores. They wrapped these around the Dreadnought's limbs and torso, arguing loudly about the best way to secure their prize. Getting the Dreadnought unstuck from the ground proved to be a challenge. Its feet had sunk deep into the soft earth, and roots had grown around and through the lower leg joints. The orcs attacked this problem with their usual combination of enthusiasm and violence. Some dug around the feet with improvised shovels. Others simply grabbed the chains and started pulling, their impressive orcish strength beginning to shift the Dreadnought even before all the roots had been cleared. There was a tremendous cracking sound as roots tore and the dreadnought shifted forward. One orc, who had been standing too close, got clipped by a swinging foot and was sent flying into a tree, where he landed with a satisfying crunch. The other orcs, demonstrating the famous orcish concern for their fellows, laughed uproariously and got back to pulling. It took the better part of 2 hours to drag the dreadnought back to camp. The orcs rigged up a crude sledge made from metal plates torn from a destroyed building, placed the dreadnought on it, and then hitched several of their vehicles to the makeshift transport. The convoy lurched forward, the vehicles straining against the weight, their engines roaring and belching black smoke as they hauled their prize through the forest. The journey was marked by frequent stops as the sledge got caught on obstacles or the chains broke under the strain. Each time, the orcs would swarm over the problem, fixing it with more chains or simply pushing harder until something gave way. By the time they reached camp, 3 Gretchen had been accidentally crushed under the sledge, 2 vehicles had thrown their engines from the strain, and approximately half the orcs involved in the operation had sustained injuries of various severity. The orcs considered this an acceptable casualty rate and were in high spirits as they finally hauled the dreadnought into Bludgett's workshop area. The examination phase mech boy. Bludgett's workshop was a study in organized chaos, if one was being generous with the term organized. It occupied the shell of what had once been a large warehouse, its walls still standing, but its roof mostly gone. Inside, the floor was covered in a layer of scrap metal, bits of machinery, oil stains, and the occasional Gretchen who had wandered in looking for scraps and never wandered back out. Workbenches lined the walls, each one piled high with tools, weapons in various states of repair, and projects that Bludgett had started and then abandoned when something more interesting came along. The air was thick with the smell of oil, burning metal, and a particular acrid scent that came from whatever fuel mixture Bludgett was currently using in his welding torch. The dreadnought was positioned in the center of the space, where Bludgett had the most room to work. He'd ordered all the other orcs out except for a few Gretchen servants who scurried around fetching tools and occasionally getting kicked when they were too slow. Scarfang had wanted to stay and watch, but even he recognized that Bludgett worked better without an audience, so he'd grudgingly left with promises that he'd be kept informed of any discoveries. Bludgett circled the dreadnought slowly, his beady eyes taking in every detail. This was the kind of project that made being a mech worthwhile. Sure, building a new buggy or fixing a truck was satisfying work, but this was different. This was a challenge, a puzzle that needed solving, a piece of technology that represented the best the Humies could build. He started with the external armor, using a combination of scrapers and wire brushes to remove the accumulated rust and vegetation. As the grime came away, he could see the original paint scheme beneath, faded but still visible, blue and white with lightning bolt symbols. Some kind of Space Marine chapter, though Bludgett didn't know or care which one. What mattered was the quality of the armor itself. Ceramite, he muttered to himself, running a hand over the exposed plating. Good stuff this. Strong, light, hard to work with, but strong. He moved to the legs, examining the joints and hydraulic systems. The damage here was considerable. One of the hydraulic lines had ruptured, probably during the battle that disabled the dreadnought in the first place. The fluid had long since leaked away, leaving the joint stiff and barely functional. But the bones of the system were still there, and with some work, Bludgett was confident he could get it moving again. The right arm with the assault cannon was going to be more problematic. The weapon had seized up completely, its barrel packed with rust and debris. Bludgett tried to rotate the barrel assembly and found it completely frozen. He made a note to himself to either replace the weapon entirely or spend considerable time cleaning and rebuilding it. Given orc preferences for more dakka, he was already thinking about what he could mount on that arm instead. The power fist on the left arm was in better shape, though the hydraulic system that powered its crushing grip was compromised. Bludgett extended one of his mechadendrites and carefully probed the interior mechanisms. following the hydraulic lines from the wrist up to the shoulder joint. He found several leaks and one completely severed line, but nothing that couldn't be repaired with the right materials. He moved to the torso, where the real mysteries lay. The Dreadnought's power core was located somewhere in the chassis, probably in the lower torso area. Bludget needed to access it to understand why the machine was in low power mode, and, more importantly, to see if he could reroute power to get more systems online. The problem was finding a way in. The Dreadnought was designed to protect its pilot and its critical systems from enemy fire, which meant everything important was buried behind layers of armor and locked access panels. Bludget spent an hour just looking for service hatches, using his mechadendrites to probe every seam and joint, looking for anything that might give him access to the interior. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a maintenance panel on the lower back of the chassis, hidden behind a decorative plate bearing the Storm Warden's chapter symbol. The panel was sealed with bolt locks that had corroded over the centuries. Bludget attacked them with a combination of penetrating oil and brute force, using a massive wrench to twist the bolts until they either turned or snapped off entirely. The panel came free with a groan of protesting metal, revealing a cavity filled with cables, conduits, and what looked like a backup power system. Bludget peered inside, his crude but effective understanding of technology allowing him to trace the flow of power from the main reactor through various subsystems. "Ha," he said with satisfaction. "There you are." The reactor was indeed in low power mode, its output throttled way down to preserve the pilot's life support, but the reactor itself seemed to be intact. Bludget could see the telltale glow of active plasma containment, dim but present. With the right adjustments, he could potentially bring the reactor back up to full power. But that raised an interesting question. If he brought the reactor to full power, what would the Dreadnought do? Would it just stay dormant, waiting for some activation signal it would never receive? Or would its machine spirit wake up, perhaps interpreting the power restoration as a sign that it was time to return to battle? And what about the thing inside? The pilot, or what was left of him? Bludget's scans had confirmed that there was indeed something organic in the sarcophagus, something being kept alive by the Dreadnought systems. If the power came back on, would it wake up too? These questions occupied Bludget's mind as he continued his examination. He mapped out the various systems, noting which ones seemed functional and which ones would need repair or replacement. The locomotion systems could be restored with new hydraulic fluid and some seal replacements. The assault cannon was a lost cause, but that just meant he could mount something more interesting in its place. The power fist could be repaired. The armor was intact, except for a few damaged plates. The real question was the pilot and the machine spirit. Bludget understood, in his crude Orkish way, that the Humies put some kind of thinking part in their machines, especially the big ones. The Imperium called it a machine spirit. The Orks just called it the thinking bit. But whatever you called it, Bludget knew that some machines had it and some didn't, and the ones that did could be unpredictable. He activated his scanning equipment again, this time focusing on the sarcophagus itself. The readings were strange, showing minimal biological activity, but definite neural patterns. Whatever was in there was alive, but in some kind of suspended state, its brain barely ticking over. The life support systems were working perfectly, maintaining the exact temperatures, chemical balances, and fluid pressures needed to keep the pilot alive indefinitely. "Interesting," Bludget muttered. "Very interesting." One of the Gretchen servants, a particularly bold one named Scratch, had crept closer to watch Bludget work. "Boss Bludget," the Gretchen squeaked. "What you gonna do with it?" Bludget considered the question. He had several options. He could try to restore the Dreadnought to working order and wake up whatever was inside, which would probably result in a fight. Orks loved fights, so this had appeal. Alternatively, he could strip out the pilot and the machine spirit entirely and convert the Dreadnought into a kind of super killer can, piloted by a Gretchen, or maybe even an Ork. This would give him a powerful war machine under his direct control. Or, and this was the option that was really starting to appeal to him, he could do both. Wake up the pilot and fight it while trying to control the Dreadnought remotely. The chaos that would result from such an experiment was exactly the kind of thing that made Mech Boy work so satisfying. But first, he needed to get the thing functioning again. And for that, he needed parts. Lots of parts. Mech Boy intervention. Over the next several days, Mech Boy Bludget transformed into a whirlwind of activity. He dispatched groups of orcs to scavenge the surrounding area for anything that might be useful. Metal plates, hydraulic components, cables, power cells, anything and everything that could be incorporated into his restoration project. The orcs, always eager for something to do, threw themselves into the task with enthusiasm. What returned to camp was an eclectic collection of salvage. Hydraulic lines from destroyed vehicles, power cables from ruined buildings, metal plates that could be melted down and reforged. Even a few intact servo motors from what looked like an old mining operation. Bludget sorted through it all with the practiced eye of someone who had spent his entire life making things from scrap. The first priority was the hydraulic system. Bludget fabricated new seals from a combination of rubber gaskets, salvaged from orc vehicles, and a peculiar hardening paste that he'd developed through trial and error. The paste was made from ground-up bits of old tires mixed with some kind of resin from local plants, and what Bludget swore was a bit of squig oil for luck. Whether the squig oil actually contributed to the paste's effectiveness, or whether it worked through sheer orcish belief in its properties, was a question best left to philosophers. He replaced the damaged hydraulic lines with new ones, crimping the connections with tools that were half wrench, half hammer. When the connections leaked, he applied more of his paste and hit them with his welding torch until the paste hardened into something approaching a functional seal. The whole process was loud, smoky, and probably violated every principle of proper hydraulic system maintenance. But when Bludget was done, the leg joints could move again. Testing the legs required power, which meant Bludget had to start working on the reactor. This was delicate work, even by his standards. Reactors were dangerous things, prone to explosions if handled incorrectly. But Bludget was a big mech, and if there was one thing big mechs understood, it was power systems. He accessed the reactor through the maintenance panel, using his mechadendrites to carefully adjust the throttle controls. The reactor responded slowly, its plasma containment fields strengthening as more fuel was directed into the reaction chamber. Bludget watched the power output carefully, making minute adjustments to prevent any sudden surges that might damage the Dreadnought's systems. As the power level increased, new systems began to come online. Lights flickered to life on the Dreadnought's chassis, dim at first, but growing brighter. Status indicators that had been dark for 1,500 years suddenly glowed with amber and green illumination. And deep within the sarcophagus, the life support systems that had been running at absolute minimum power began to increase their activity. Inside the sarcophagus, suspended in amniotic fluids that had remained perfectly sterile for over a millennium, Brother Captain, Meridius's brain registered the first stirrings of change. His consciousness, reduced to the barest spark for so long that time had lost all meaning, began to feel the pull of wakefulness. It was not a gentle process. The neural interfaces that connected his mind to the Dreadnought systems began to activate, sending signals through pathways that had been dormant for centuries. But Meridius did not wake, not yet. The activation process was slow and gradual, designed to prevent shock to the pilot's system. As power increased, the Dreadnought's cogitators began running through automated startup sequences, checking systems and running diagnostics. These processes would normally require several hours to complete, time for the pilot's mind to adjust from the deep sleep of stasis to the waking world of consciousness. Bludget, oblivious to the stirring consciousness within the sarcophagus, continued his work. He rerouted power to the leg servos and tested them one at a time. the right leg. The one with the damaged hydraulics moved sluggishly at first, its joints grinding and protesting. But as fluid began to circulate through the repaired lines, the movement became smoother. Bludget watched with satisfaction as the massive leg lifted off the ground and set back down with a thud that shook the workshop. The left leg was in better shape and responded more readily. Bludget had it flexing and extending within minutes, though he noticed some concerning vibrations in the knee joint that suggested the bearing surfaces had been damaged by long years of inactivity. He made a note to address that later, after he'd gotten the arms working. The assault cannon, as expected, was beyond salvage. Bludget removed it entirely, using a cutting torch to sever the mounting brackets and power feeds. The weapon clattered to the ground, and Bludget kicked it aside with the casual disdain of someone who knew he could build something better. Replacing it was where Ork ingenuity truly shined. Bludget had his Gretchen bring over a collection of weapons he'd been saving for a special project. There was a heavy bolter stripped from a destroyed Space Marine vehicle, still in decent condition, a couple of Ork shooters that could be linked together for more dakka, and most interestingly, a plasma gun of unknown origin that Bludget had been tinkering with for months. He decided on a combination approach, using a mounting bracket fabricated from scrap metal and welded directly to the Dreadnought's arm. He attached both the heavy bolter and a jury-rigged assembly of 3 Ork shooters. The result was an ungainly but potentially devastating weapons platform that could put out an impressive volume of fire. The power fist was easier to restore. Bludget replaced the damaged hydraulic lines, added several additional ones of his own design for extra crumpin power, and installed a crude but effective hand crank mechanism that would allow manual operation if the hydraulics failed. He tested the fist by having it grab a large piece of scrap metal, then slowly increase the pressure until the metal crumpled like paper. Satisfied, he released the crushed metal and moved on to the next system. With the mechanical systems mostly functional, Bludget turned his attention to the power core and control systems. This was where things got interesting, because this was where he would need to decide how much control he wanted over the Dreadnought and how much he was willing to let its machine spirit retain. The Dreadnought's control systems were sophisticated by Imperial standards, designed to respond to the neural commands of the pilot, while also incorporating automated responses for routine operations. The machine spirit, that quasi-mystical consciousness that inhabited the system, served as an intermediary between pilot and machine, interpreting neural commands and translating them into physical actions. Bludget, lacking the technical knowledge to fully understand these systems, approached the problem in the most Orkish way possible. He started adding his own controls. He installed a crude remote override system, basically a voxcaster linked to the Dreadnought's primary cogitator through a series of really optimistic wiring connections. In theory, this would allow him to send commands to the Dreadnought remotely. He also installed what could generously be called a big red button on a control panel he'd welded to the outside of the Dreadnought's chassis. The button was connected to the reactor's emergency shutdown system. If things went wrong, Bludget wanted a way to turn the whole thing off without having to carefully manipulate reactor controls. The fact that the button might also cause a catastrophic reactor failure didn't concern him. That was a problem for future Bludget. As he worked, he noticed the lights on the Dreadnought's chassis becoming brighter and more active. Status indicators were cycling through various colors, and he could hear the hum of systems activating deep within the machine. The cogitators were running faster now, working through their startup sequences, preparing the Dreadnought for activation. And inside the sarcophagus, Brother Captain Meridius was beginning to wake up. The awakening process. The return to consciousness was like climbing out of a well so deep that the bottom had been lost in darkness for over 1,000 years. Brother Captain Meridius became aware first of sensation, a vague and distant thing that his mind could not immediately identify. There was pressure, temperature, the feeling of being suspended in fluid. These sensations had no context, no meaning. because his mind had been dormant for so long that it had forgotten what it meant to feel anything. Neural pathways that had been dormant began to fire, slowly at first, then with increasing frequency as the Dreadnought systems stimulated his brain back to full activity. With the return of neural activity came the return of memory, fragmentary and confused at first, like trying to remember a dream from years ago. He remembered his name, Meridius, brother captain, storm wardens. The facts came back in pieces, disconnected from emotional context. He had been a space marine. He had led warriors into battle. He had fallen. He had been placed in this tomb of metal and ceramite, given a new form to continue his service to the Emperor. How long had it been? His mind groped for the answer and found nothing. The Dreadnought's chronometer would tell him once his consciousness was fully integrated with the machine systems. But for now, he existed in a kind of temporal limbo, aware that time had passed but unable to quantify it. The neural interfaces that connected his brain to the Dreadnought began to activate, establishing the connections that would allow him to control his new body. This was a process he remembered from his first awakening. The burning sensation as electronic impulses traveled along pathways that connected flesh to metal. It had been excruciating then, and it was excruciating now, though Meridius's mind had been conditioned through centuries of experience to accept the pain as a necessary part of existence. Slowly, piece by piece, his awareness expanded beyond the confines of the sarcophagus. He began to feel the Dreadnought systems as extensions of his own body. The legs became his legs. The arms became his arms. The sensors became his eyes and ears. The weapons became instruments of his will. But something was wrong. Even through the fog of awakening, Meridius could sense that the Dreadnought systems were not functioning as they should. There were gaps in the neural interface, systems that did not respond properly to his commands. The right arm felt strange, its weight distribution all wrong. The assault cannon that should have been there had been replaced with something else, something crude and not properly integrated into his neural pathways. And there were new systems, foreign presences in the machine that he did not recognize. Additional power feeds, strange control mechanisms, something that felt like an external override system, though his mind struggled to understand what that could mean. The machine spirit of the Dreadnought, roused from its own long sleep, was confused and agitated. It recognized its pilot, the neural patterns that it had been designed to serve. But it also recognized that the Dreadnought had been damaged and modified, that there were foreign elements in its systems that did not belong. The machine spirit's response was to run diagnostic routines, trying to understand what had happened and how to restore proper function. These diagnostic routines manifested as streams of data across Meridius's consciousness, information about power levels, system status, damage reports. His mind, still sluggish from its long sleep, struggled to process it all. Power at 60% and climbing. Locomotion systems functional but degraded. Right-arm weapon systems non-standard. External control systems detected. Location unknown. Time since last activation, 1,575 standard years. That last piece of information hit Meridius like a physical blow. 1,500 years. He had been asleep for 1,500 years. The chapter that had placed him in stasis, the battle brothers he had fought alongside, the campaigns he had participated in, all of that was gone now, lost to the passage of centuries. He was alone, awake in a universe that had moved on without him. But space marines, even ones interred in dreadnoughts, are trained to process shock and continue functioning. Meridius pushed aside the existential horror of his situation and focused on the immediate problem. He was awake. His systems were functional, if damaged and modified. And there were unknown entities nearby. He could sense them through the dreadnought's external sensors, the heat signatures and movement patterns of living beings. He attempted to access the visual sensors and found them still offline, though the activation sequence was running. His external microphones were functioning, however, and through them he could hear voices. Crude, guttural voices speaking a language he recognized all too well. Ork. The realization cut through the fog of awakening like a blade. Orks. The green-skinned Xenos that plagued the Imperium, that fought for the sheer joy of violence, that turned everything they touched into crude parodies of proper technology. The Orks had found him. The Orks had been working on him, modifying his sacred chassis with their filthy hands. Rage flooded through Meridius's consciousness, a pure and righteous fury that burned away the last vestiges of confusion. He was a space marine, a warrior of the Emperor, entombed in this Dreadnought to continue serving the Imperium. And the Orks, the Xenos filth, had dared to defile his form with their crude modifications. The machine spirit felt its pilot's anger and responded. Accordingly, combat protocols dormant for centuries began to activate. Weapon systems powered up. Targeting cogitators came online. The Dreadnought's reactor increased its output to combat levels, feeding power to systems that had been inactive since the day Meridius fell in battle. Outside the Dreadnought, Bludget noticed the change immediately. The lights on the chassis, which had been pulsing in a regular pattern as systems activated, suddenly began flashing rapidly. The hum of the reactor increased in pitch and volume. And most ominously, the Dreadnought's limbs, which had been still except for Bludget's tests, began to move on their own. "Zog me," Bludget said, taking a step back. "I think it's waking up." He was right. The visual sensors came online, and Meridius could suddenly see. His view was no longer limited to the interior of the sarcophagus. Instead, he was looking out through the Dreadnought's optical systems, seeing the world as the machine saw it. And what he saw made his rage intensify. Orks. Dozens of them. They had transformed what looked like an old human warehouse into some kind of crude workshop. The floor was littered with scrap metal and debris. The walls were stained with oil and covered in crude Ork graffiti. And standing directly in front of him, close enough that Meridius could have reached out and crushed it with a thought, was a big mech, its ugly face split in a grin of triumph. Brother Captain Meridius, veteran of 1,000 battles, hero of the Storm Wardens, assessed his situation in the seconds it took for his combat training to reassert control over his rage. He was damaged, but functional. He was surrounded by enemies. His chapter, if it even still existed, was certainly not coming to his aid. He was alone. But he was a space marine, and space marines do not surrender, they do not retreat. They fight until victory or death, and in death they are honored. Meridius sent a neural command to his Dreadnought's voxcasters, and for the first time in 1,575 years, his voice, mechanically amplified and resonant with fury, echoed across the Ork camp.
"Purge the Xenos!"
Brother Captain Meridius had experienced this before, this specific moment of consciousness returning after stasis. The first time had been the worst, when he was newly interred, when the memories of his former life were still fresh, and the horror of his new existence was overwhelming. He had raged against his confinement, had screamed through his voxcasters until his throat, what remained of it, was raw. The tech marines had sedated him, reducing his consciousness to nothing, while they adjusted his neural interfaces and recalibrated his life support systems. The second awakening had been different. He had emerged from stasis with a sense of purpose, called to battle against a tyrannid hive fleet that threatened the Storm Warden's home sector. That campaign had lasted for months, and Meridius had fought in battle after battle, slowly adapting to his new form, learning to see through optical sensors instead of eyes, to walk on hydraulic legs instead of flesh and bone, to kill with weapons that were part of his body rather than tools held in his hands. By the time that campaign ended, he had begun to accept his fate. He was no longer Brother Captain Meridius in the traditional sense. He was something new, something hybrid between man and machine. The chaplains called it a blessed transformation. The tech marines called it the highest form of service. Meridius called it survival, because what else could he do but survive, continue, endure. He had served in his Dreadnought chassis for decades after that second awakening. He had fought in 17 major campaigns, had destroyed enemy armor by the dozens, had crushed Xenos beneath his feet on 100 different worlds. He had become one of the chapter's most decorated ancients, his counsels sought by captains and chapter masters, his presence on the battlefield a source of inspiration for younger battle brothers. And then had come the campaign on this world, the one whose name he could no longer remember. He remembered the enemy, some kind of chaos cult that had turned an entire planetary defense force against the Imperium. He remembered the final battle, when the cult's leaders had summoned something from the warp, a demon of terrible power that had torn through the Storm Warden's lines like they were made of paper. Meridius had stood against that demon. He had poured fire into it from his assault cannon, had crushed its manifested form with his power fist, and he had won, or thought he had won, until the dying demon had lashed out with some kind of reality-warping attack that had overloaded his reactor and sent him crashing to the ground. He remembered his brothers gathering around him as his systems failed. He remembered the tech marine examining his chassis, pronouncing the damage severe but repairable. He remembered being told that he would be placed in stasis until proper repairs could be made, that it would only be for a short time, that the chapter would return for him. And then he had slept, and continued sleeping through centuries he knew nothing about. While the galaxy turned and wars were fought, and his chapter forgot about him, lost him to the endless bureaucratic chaos that characterized the Imperium's military operations. Now he was awake again, and everything was wrong. The neural pathways that connected his consciousness to the Dreadnought felt strange, corrupted by foreign modifications. The weight distribution of his chassis was all wrong. Systems he expected to be there were missing or altered beyond recognition. And worst of all, he was surrounded by Xenos, by the enemies of the Imperium, by creatures that had dared to lay their filthy hands on his sacred form. The rage that flooded through him was clean and pure, a righteous fury that burned away the last traces of confusion and disorientation. He was a space marine. He was a warrior of the Emperor, and he would purge these Xenos with fire and fury, or he would die trying. Either outcome was preferable to allowing them to defile him further. The battle unleashed. The Ork camp erupted into chaos. Bludgett's first response was to dive to the side as the Dreadnought's newly installed weapons array swung toward him. The heavy bolter roared to life, spitting mass reactive shells that tore through the workshop's walls like paper. The Ork shooters added their rattling fire to the cacophony, filling the air with a storm of bullets that ricocheted off metal and tore through anything unfortunate enough to be in their path. 3 Gretchen, who had been standing too close, simply ceased to exist, their bodies pulverized by the initial burst of fire. The workshop's far wall exploded outward in a shower of debris as heavy bolter shells detonated against it. Orks scattered in all directions, some running for their weapons, others simply running, and a few brave or stupid ones charging directly at the Dreadnought with their choppers raised. Meridius, his consciousness now fully integrated with the Dreadnought's systems, moved with the practiced efficiency of a warrior who had spent centuries mastering the art of mechanized combat. The right arm swung in a wide arc, the improvised weapons array tracking targets with deadly precision. Each burst of fire was carefully calculated, each shell finding its mark. Orks fell, their tough hides no match for mass reactive ammunition designed to penetrate power armor. The power fist came down like the hammer of the Emperor himself, crushing an Ork that had gotten too close. The hydraulic systems that Bludgett had repaired groaned under the force of the blow, but they held. The Ork didn't. Its body was reduced to a green pulp that sprayed across the workshop floor. Meridius took his first step, the massive foot of the Dreadnought coming down with enough force to crack the concrete beneath it. The Cicere, leg servos, repaired by Bludgett's crude but effective methods, responded to his neural commands. He took another step, then another, the Dreadnought's gait becoming steadier as Meridius's consciousness fully adapted to controlling his mechanical body once more.
Emperor's wrath!
Meridius roared through his voxcasters, the words echoing across the camp like thunder.
Death to the Xenos!
The Orks, to their credit, did not flee. Fleeing was not really in their nature. Instead, they grabbed whatever weapons were at hand and charged toward this unexpected fight with the enthusiasm that only Orks can muster. Scarfang emerged from his tent, saw the chaos unfolding in Bludgett's workshop, and immediately began bellowing orders.
Boys, get stuck in! Somebody wake up the knobs! Where's me big shooter?
More Orks poured into the workshop, or what was left of it. The walls were mostly gone now, torn apart by Meridius's initial assault. But the Orks didn't care about property damage. They cared about the fight, and this was shaping up to be a proper scrap. Meridius turned to face the new wave of attackers, his targeting cogitators identifying threats and prioritizing targets. A mob of boys carrying sluggers and choppers were charging from the left. A group of knobs, larger and better armed, were approaching from the right, and somewhere in the chaos, he could see what looked like a big mech, probably the same one who had dared to modify his sacred chassis, taking cover behind a pile of scrap metal. The heavy bolter spoke again, its shells tearing into the mob of boys. Orks fell in sprays of blood and torn flesh, but the survivors kept coming, their savage war cries mixing with the roar of gunfire. They reached the Dreadnought and began attacking it with their choppers, the crude blades clanging off ceramite armor in a shower of sparks. Meridius felt the impacts through his neural interface, each blow registering as a distant sensation against his armored hide. The choppers could not penetrate his armor, not easily, though he noted with concern that some of the Orks were attacking the joints and seams where Bludgett had made repairs. Those repairs, made with Ork technology and methodology, were not as sturdy as the original Imperial craftsmanship. He responded by pivoting on one leg and sweeping the other in a wide arc, the massive foot catching 3 Orks and sending them flying through the air. They crashed into their fellows, creating a moment of confusion that Meridius exploited by bringing both arms to bear on the knobs approaching from the right. The fight settled into a rhythm, the kind of brutal close-quarters combat that dreadnoughts were designed for. Meridius would fire at distant targets, crushing or sweeping aside those that got too close, constantly moving to prevent the Orks from surrounding him. The Orks, for their part, kept coming in waves, each one more enthusiastic than the last. This was what they lived for, after all. A proper fight against a tough opponent. The boys were having the time of their lives, and even as their numbers dwindled, more kept arriving, drawn by the sound of battle. Bludgett, watching from his hiding spot, was experiencing a complex mixture of emotions. On one hand, his beautiful project had come to life and was working even better than he'd hoped. The repairs were holding, the weapons were firing, and the thing was putting up a hell of a fight. On the other hand, it was killing his fellow Orks, which was not exactly what he'd had in mind when he'd started this project. He briefly considered trying to activate his remote override system, but the chaos of battle made that impractical. Instead, he began working his way around the perimeter of the fight, his mechadendrites clutching a massive wrench. If he could get close enough to the Dreadnought, he might be able to manually access that emergency shutdown button he'd installed, or at the very least, he could hit something important with his wrench and see what happened. Meridius, fighting on multiple fronts, did not see Bludgett's approach. His attention was focused on a particularly large knob who had just arrived carrying what looked like a power claw, an Ork weapon capable of actually damaging his armor. The knob charged with a roar, its power claw crackling with barely contained energy. The two war machines met in a clash of metal on metal. The power claw connected with Meridius's right arm, its energy field disrupting the molecular bonds of the ceramite and tearing a chunk of armor away. Warning indicators flashed across Meridius's consciousness as the damage registered. The weapons array on that arm was compromised, the heavy bolter's mounting bracket damaged. Meridius responded by grabbing the knob with his power fist. The hydraulic systems, enhanced by Bludgett's additional power feeds, closed with crushing force. The knob's armor crumpled, and then the orc inside it, bones breaking and organs rupturing under the tremendous pressure. Meridius lifted the dying orc and threw it into a group of approaching boys, scattering them like bowling pins. But the damage was done. The right arm was degraded, the weapons array hanging at an awkward angle. Meridius could still use it, but not at full effectiveness. He adapted, relying more on the power fist and using his damaged right arm primarily for sweeping attacks rather than precise shooting. The battle had been raging for perhaps 5 minutes, though to the participants it felt both longer and shorter, as combat always does. The orc camp was in ruins, the workshop completely destroyed. Bodies, or what was left of them, littered the ground. But the orcs kept coming, and Meridius could feel his Dreadnought systems beginning to strain under the continuous operation. The reactor was running hot, pushed to its limits by the demands of combat. Cooling systems that had been compromised by centuries of inactivity were struggling to dissipate the excess heat. Hydraulic fluid was leaking from several damaged seals, reducing the efficiency of his limbs. Ammunition for the heavy bolter was running low, though the orc shooters seemed to have an inexhaustible supply thanks to the mysterious orc ability to make bullets appear when needed. And then Bludget made his move. The big mech had worked his way around to the Dreadnought's back, using the chaos of battle as cover. He extended his mechadendrites, reaching for the control panel he'd installed, specifically for the big red emergency shutdown button. Meridius, with sensors covering all angles, detected the movement and attempted to pivot to address this new threat. But Bludget was fast, and more importantly, he was close. His mechadendrite slammed down on the button before Meridius could react. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Dreadnought's reactor began an emergency shutdown sequence, its power output dropping rapidly. Meridius felt his systems failing, the neural connections becoming sluggish as power levels fell. His limbs became heavy and unresponsive. His weapons fell silent. The lights on his chassis flickered and died. And then, because this was Orc technology and nothing Orcs build ever works quite as intended, the emergency shutdown system did exactly what Bludget had feared it might do. Instead of safely powering down the reactor, it caused a catastrophic feedback loop in the plasma containment system. The reactor didn't explode, not exactly, but it did undergo what could politely be called an unscheduled rapid energy release event. A burst of superheated plasma vented from the Dreadnought's back, shooting out through the maintenance panel that Bludget had never properly sealed. The plasma jet, searingly hot and intensely bright, caught Bludget full in the face. The big mech's scream was mercifully brief. The plasma incinerated him almost instantly, reducing him to ash in the span of a second. The jet of energy continued past him, setting fire to everything in its path before finally dissipating. The plasma release had vented enough energy to prevent a full reactor breach, but it had also crippled the Dreadnought's power systems. Meridius felt his consciousness beginning to fade as the neural interfaces lost power. His last sight, before darkness claimed him once more, was of Scarfang standing over the smouldering remains of Bludget, looking simultaneously impressed and annoyed. "Well, zog me," the war boss said. "That was spectacular." Then Meridius's consciousness faded, and he knew nothing more. The aftermath. When Meridius next awoke, it was not to the chaos of battle, but to the sensation of movement. His Dreadnought was being transported, hauled on some kind of vehicle through terrain he could not see. His visual sensors were offline, his weapon systems unresponsive. He existed in a state of minimal awareness, able to perceive only the barest sensations through what few systems still had power. The reactor was operating at absolute minimum, levels just enough to keep his life support functioning. Everything else was shut down, either damaged beyond function or deliberately powered off to conserve energy. He tried to move and found his limbs completely unresponsive. He tried to access his voxcasters and found them silent. He was aware but helpless, locked in his metal tomb with no way to affect the world outside. Through his external microphones, which still functioned on backup power, He could hear Ork voices. They were arguing about something, their guttural language washing over him in an incomprehensible tide. Occasionally, he would hear his Dreadnought's designations spoken in their crude pronunciation, along with words he did recognize: loot, scrap, and most ominously, da boss. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Without visual input and with his chronometer offline, Meridius had no way to track time. He existed in a limbo of consciousness, aware but unable to act, his mind turning over and over the events that had led him here. He had failed. That was the inescapable conclusion. He had awakened to find himself in enemy hands, had fought with all his strength, and had still been overcome. Not by superior skill or firepower, but by crude Ork cunning and their bizarre technology. The shame of it burned in his consciousness like acid. But beneath the shame, there was something else. A realization that was perhaps more disturbing than his defeat. He had been awake for only a few minutes before being shut down again. But in those minutes, he had felt something he hadn't felt in the last moments before his long sleep began. He had felt alive. The rage that had filled him upon seeing the Orks, the satisfaction of crushing enemies beneath his fist, the pure adrenaline rush of combat. These had all been sharp and real in a way that nothing had been for so long. For 1,500 years, he had existed in dreamless darkness, consciousness reduced to nothing. And then, suddenly, he had been thrust back into the world, forced to fight for his existence, to pit his will and skill against an enemy that wanted him destroyed. And despite the horror of his situation, despite the shame of his defeat, he had to admit to himself that it had felt good. To matter again, to have purpose again, to be something more than a ghost suspended in amniotic fluid, waiting for an awakening that might never come. The movement stopped. Meridius heard the sound of chains being removed, felt his Dreadnought being lifted and set down on solid ground. More Ork voices, these ones sounding authoritative. He wished desperately that he could understand what they were saying, that he could see what was happening. Then, unexpectedly, a new sound. Not Ork voices, but a mechanical whirring, followed by a click. One of his visual sensors flickered to life, probably powered by someone attempting to activate his systems. The image was grainy and distorted, but Meridius could see. He was in some kind of clearing, surrounded by Orks. His Dreadnought had been placed in what looked like the center of an arena, a circular space surrounded by ramshackle barriers made from scrap metal and vehicle parts. Orks lined these barriers, hundreds of them, all watching him with eager anticipation. And standing directly in front of him, close enough that even his damaged visual sensors could make out every detail, was the largest Ork he'd ever seen. It had to be at least 3.5 meters tall, its muscles bulging with barely contained power. It wore armor made from dozens of different sources, all painted red for extra speed. And in its massive hands, it held a weapon that looked like someone had taken a chainsaw, a power claw, and several rocket boosters and welded them together. The war boss, Meridius realized. This was Scarfang, the leader of this warband, and from the looks of things, Meridius was about to become entertainment. Scarfang raised his composite weapon and roared something in his crude language. The Orks lining the barriers roared back, a sound like thunder. Then Scarfang charged, his weapon revving to life, and the crowd went wild. Meridius tried to move, tried to raise his arms to defend himself, but his systems remained offline. He could do nothing but watch through his single functioning visual sensor as the warboss approached, murder gleaming in its red eyes. But just before Scarfang reached him, something unexpected happened. A group of Orks pushed through the crowd, led by a smaller greenskin wearing the remains of Bludgett's armor. This new Ork, apparently Bludgett's apprentice or successor, was carrying some kind of tool, and it began working on Meridius's chassis, even as Scarfang bellowed in frustration. The new mech ignored Scarfang's protests and continued working. Meridius felt power beginning to flow to his systems. Not much, but enough. The mech had apparently managed to bypass some of the damaged circuits and was routing power directly to his motor. controls. Slowly, agonizingly, Meridius felt control returning to his limbs. It was like trying to move through thick mud, his every motion delayed and sluggish, but he could move. He could fight. Scarfang, seeing that his prey was now capable of fighting back, laughed with genuine delight. This was what he'd wanted, after all. Not a helpless target, but a real opponent. He charged again, his weapon screaming, and this time, Meridius raised his power fist to meet him. The impact rang out across the arena like a bell. Metal met metal, and both combatants were driven back by the force of the blow. The Orks watching roared their approval, and the real fight began. What followed was less a battle and more a brutal slugging match between two massively powerful war machines. Meridius, operating at perhaps 30% of his normal capacity with damaged systems and makeshift repairs, fought with every ounce of skill and determination he possessed. Scarfang, empowered by the Warg field and his own immense strength, fought with savage joy. They traded blows that would have leveled buildings, each impact sending shockwaves through the ground. Meridius's power fist caught Scarfang in the chest, crumpling his armor and sending him staggering back. Scarfang's weapon tore through Meridius's right arm completely, severing it at the shoulder in a spray of sparks and hydraulic fluid. The fight could have only one ending. Meridius was too damaged, too weakened by his long sleep and the Ork modifications. But he fought on because that was what Space Marines did. They fought until victory or death. And in the end, it was death that claimed him, or something close to it. Scarfang's final blow tore through the Dreadnought's torso armor, penetrating deep into the chassis. Critical systems failed, and Meridius felt his consciousness beginning to fade for what he somehow knew would be the last time. His final thought, before darkness claimed him, was neither of regret nor of fear. It was a simple prayer, the words that every Space Marine learns and carries with them always. Emperor, protect. Historical context and broader implications. The encounter between brother Captain Meridius and Scarfang's warband represents a phenomenon that has occurred countless times across the galaxy, though rarely with such dramatic results. The meeting of Ork and Dreadnought, of Xenos technology and Imperial craftsmanship, of brute cunning and ancient honor, is a collision that encapsulates many of the fundamental conflicts that define the 41st millennium. Dreadnoughts that have been lost or abandoned are not uncommon in the vast expanse of Imperial space. The galaxy is enormous beyond human comprehension, containing billions of worlds across millions of light years. The Imperium of man, despite its name, controls only a fraction of this space, and even within controlled sectors, there are countless worlds that have been forgotten, lost to bureaucratic oversight, or simply abandoned as untenable. Space Marine chapters fight on thousands of these worlds, deploying their forces wherever the Imperium's enemies threaten, and sometimes, in the chaos of war, equipment is left behind. A dreadnought might be damaged beyond immediate repair and marked for recovery, only for the chapter to be called away to a more urgent conflict before the recovery can be completed. Or a world might be declared perdita, lost to the Imperium, leaving behind whatever equipment could not be evacuated in time. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains extensive records of lost technology, creating lists and catalogues of equipment that needs to be recovered. But these lists are vast, containing millions of entries, and the Mechanicus has limited resources. A single lost dreadnought on a forgotten world is unlikely to be prioritized when there are entire forge worlds under threat or STC fragments to be recovered. This means that across the galaxy, there are likely hundreds or even thousands of dreadnoughts in various states of abandonment. Some may have been destroyed beyond any hope of recovery, their sarcophagi cracked open and their pilots long dead. Others may remain in stasis, their power cores still functioning, waiting for a rescue that may never come. And still others may have been found by various factions, each responding to the discovery in their own way. The Orks, with their love of looting and their bizarre relationship with technology, represent a particular threat to abandoned Imperial equipment. When Orks find a dreadnought, Their first instinct is to claim it as salvage. The fact that it might still contain a living space marine is, to most orcs, a feature rather than a bug. The possibility of a good fight is always appealing. But not all orcs approach the situation the same way. Blood axes, the most tactically minded of orc clans, might attempt to capture a dreadnought intact for study, or to use as leverage in dealing with other orcs. Bad moons, the Tauntin, wealthy traders of orc society, might try to sell it to other factions. Death Skulls, obsessed with looting, would definitely try to strip it for parts, while keeping the most impressive components for themselves. What happened to brother Captain Meridius is an example of a relatively moderate outcome. He was modified, activated, fought, and ultimately destroyed. But there are worse fates that could befall a dreadnought in orc hands. Some orc mech boys, particularly ambitious or cruel ones, have been known to keep captured dreadnoughts alive indefinitely, activating them periodically for entertainment or to test new weapons. The pilot, unable to die and unable to escape, becomes a perpetual prisoner, awakening only to fight and suffer before being forced back into darkness. There are also instances of orcs attempting to repurpose dreadnoughts entirely, removing the pilot and converting the chassis into some kind of super killer can. These attempts usually fail, as the dreadnought's machine, spirit typically rebels against being controlled by Xenos. But occasionally, through a combination of orc cunning and the strange effects of the War field, they succeed, creating hybrid war machines that horrify both sides of the conflict. From an Imperial perspective, each lost dreadnought represents a tragedy on multiple levels. There is the loss of the equipment itself, rare and valuable technology that represents decades or centuries of craftsmanship. There is the loss of the pilot, a hero whose sacrifice has been desecrated by falling into enemy hands. And there is the loss of the knowledge and experience that the pilot carried, centuries of tactical wisdom now forever beyond the chapter's reach. Space Marine. Chapters that lose dreadnoughts take the loss seriously. Tech Marines may spend years attempting to locate and recover lost equipment. Chaplains will lead special missions to retrieve the sarcophagi of fallen ancients, ensuring that they receive proper burial rites, even if the chassis is beyond recovery. Some chapters maintain detailed records of every dreadnought they have ever deployed, tracking their locations and status with religious devotion. But the galaxy is vast and merciless, and not all losses can be recovered. For every dreadnought that is successfully retrieved, there are dozens more that remain lost, their pilots sleeping or suffering in forgotten corners of space. It is a grim reminder of the fundamental truth of the 41st millennium. In the darkness of the far future, there is no peace, no respite, and precious little mercy. Conclusion. The story of what happens when orcs find a dreadnought that has been asleep for 1,575 years is not a story with a happy ending. It is a tragedy, a tale of desecration and futile struggle, of a hero denied his final rest and forced to fight one last, hopeless battle. But it is also a very Warhammer 40,000 story, embodying the grimdark nature of the setting and the particular horror that comes from the meeting of Imperial and Xenos cultures. Brother Captain Meridius, who fell in battle over 15 centuries ago, who was placed in his dreadnought to continue serving the Emperor, who slept through the rise and fall of civilizations, woke to find himself in a nightmare. The chapter he served may still exist somewhere in the galaxy, but they have long since moved on, believing him lost. The battle he fought, that he gave his life for, has been forgotten by all but the most meticulous historians. Even his name, recorded in the Dreadnought's databanks, is unknown to anyone still living. He woke to find himself in the hands of enemies, his sacred chassis defiled by Xenos modifications. He fought with all the skill and fury that had made him a hero of the Storm Wardens. And he fell again, this time permanently, destroyed in what amounted to orc entertainment. There is no glory in this ending. There is no victory, no triumph of the Imperium over its enemies. There is only the grim reality of a galaxy where even the mighty can fall, where heroes can be forgotten, and where the Xenos wait in the darkness to claim what the Imperium cannot protect. For the Orks, Meridius's Dreadnought was just another piece of loot, another interesting bit of scrap to tinker with and eventually destroy. They learned little from the experience, gained no lasting advantage, and moved on to their next fight with typical Orc single-mindedness. Scarfang's warband probably fell apart within months, killed in some subsequent campaign or absorbed into a larger war. The Orcs who witnessed the fight told stories about it for a while, then forgot about it when newer and more exciting battles came along. This is the nature of Warhammer 40,000, a universe so vast and so violent that even the greatest heroes can be reduced to footnotes, their sacrifices meaningful only to those who remember them. And in a galaxy where entire worlds can be lost and forgotten, where history is constantly being rewritten or destroyed, memory itself is the most fragile thing of all. But perhaps there is something to be learned from Meridius's story. It is a reminder that the Imperium's strength comes not from its technology or its numbers, but from the will of individuals to serve something greater than themselves. Even in defeat, even in desecration, Meridius fought. He could have remained dormant, let the Orcs strip his chassis for parts without resistance. Instead, he awoke, he fought, and he reminded the Xenos that the Imperium's warriors do not go quietly into the darkness. His final prayer, Emperor Protect, was more than just words. It was an affirmation of faith, a declaration that even in his darkest hour, even facing defeat and death, he had not abandoned the ideals he had sworn to uphold. Whether the Emperor heard that prayer, whether it had any effect on the vast and uncaring machinery of the Imperium, is unknowable. But the prayer was made, and that act of faith, however small, matters. This is what happens when Orcs find a Dreadnought that has been asleep for 1,175 years. They wake a nightmare that they cannot control. They face the fury of a warrior whose dedication transcends death itself. And in the end, they win, because in the grim darkness of the far future, the Imperium's enemies are as numerous as the stars, and even the mightiest warrior must eventually fall. But before they fall, they fight. And that, perhaps, is all that can be asked of any warrior in this terrible age. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the grim darkness of the far future, please hit that like button and subscribe to Stories of Hammer for more Warhammer 40k lore, narratives, and explorations of this endlessly fascinating universe. The Emperor protects, but knowledge arms the vigilant. Until next time, stay vigilant in the darkness.